Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for attending our panel, which is titled Learning to Live Free, How High Schools Should Teach Civics. We got a reaction already, so that's good to hear. That's all right. My name is Tom Lindsay. I direct the Center for Innovation and Education here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you. Short explanation as to the title, Learning to Live Free. Alexis DeToqueville, in his book, Democracy in America, said that the Americans have made a new political order. And he said that new political order, if it is to survive, must require a new political education. And Tocqueville said that education must consist in teaching citizens, quote, the art of living free, unquote. Right? Okay. Now, to discuss this topic, we have three wonderful panelists, and I'm very grateful that they've agreed to come. Beginning here to my immediate left is David Bobb. David, since 2013, has been the president of the Bill of Rights Institute. If you don't know about it, you should look it up. It's a great civic ed organization. He previously worked at Hillsdale College for 12 years, where he was the founding director of the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. David is also the author of Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue. And he recently completed a chapter on Frederick Douglass. He's written for the Wall Street Journal and other publications, and he earned his PhD in political science from Boston College. Thank you, David. To David's immediate left is Michelle Nere, known by some of you already. Michelle is a secondary social studies specialist for Spring Independent School District and has been an educator for more than 20 years. She writes curriculum for a variety of learners, coaches teachers, and offers professional development for teachers at the district, as well as the social studies conferences. In other words, Michelle is in the trenches, right? And we will benefit from her in the trenches knowledge. She was named Teacher of the Year at her schools at two different campuses in 2014 and 2017. She was named Lesson Plan Writer of 2017 for Constituting America and the Social Studies Supervisor of the Year for the state of Texas in 2019. Congratulations, Michelle. Yes. Thank you for coming, Michelle. Last, but by no means least, is Representative James Tallarico. Representative Tallarico, I think this is your first panel. Well, we're honored that you've chosen us, so thank you for attending. Representative Tallarico was elected to serve House District 52 in 2018. He also has experience in the trenches. He taught middle school in San Antonio before becoming the Central Texas Executive Director for Reasoning Mind, a nonprofit dedicated to equipping classrooms with innovative technology. He currently serves as the youngest member of the Texas Legislature, and he sits on both the Public Education Committee and the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee. Outside of his role as a legislator, he works with Maya Consulting, crafting and implementing education solutions across Texas. And finally, he has earned degrees from both the University of Texas at Austin and this other place in Massachusetts. What was it, Harvard? Yes, okay. So UT and this other school. Thank you very much for coming, Representative Tallarico. I'll try to frame our discussion, and then we'll turn to ask questions of our panelists. Well, let me first by asking a question of the audience. American government is divided into three branches. Can you name them? Raise your hand if you can. Yeah. That's good news. Bad news is you're in the minority. Right? A number of national polls find that only 26% of all Americans can name the three branches of government. Right? This is down from 38% in 2011. Worse, 33% of Americans surveyed were unable to name even one branch of government. Right? Don't get me wrong here. This is not blaming the kids. We're supposed to be the ones teaching them. right? I'm just giving you the facts, right? Now, this issue has become so pressing that it's gone bipartisan, right? We remember in 1983, under the Reagan administration, we had a nation at risk, which warned us about this. At the time, it was treated as more of a conservative issue, right? But that's really ended. It's gone bipartisan, and in fact, CNN's Chris Celica wrote a piece on the latest surveys that measure America's civic literacy. And in CNN's Chris Celica's words, he said, it constitutes, quote, a bouillabaisse of ignorance, unquote. Right? Now, among other things, these studies have found that 37% of those polled could not even name one right protected by the First Amendment. Right? And as sad as all this is, these results are not isolated by any means. In fact, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation conducted a study that showed that most Americans today would fail the U.S. citizenship test. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the U.S. citizenship test. It's only 10 questions, right? You get to study from a database of 100. You know what they're going to be. You only have to get 6 multiple choice questions right to pass. 91% of immigrants to this country pass the first time. But only 45% of Americans under the age of 60 can pass, and it gets even worse. Those under the age of 45, only 19% of native-born Americans in this country today can get even 6 out of 10 right on the U.S. citizenship test. Higher ed reformers like us at TPPF regard that as a crisis. And I don't think we're the only ones. As a matter of fact, we just got back a statewide poll of registered voters in Texas, which finds that nearly 4 out of 5 Texans surveyed, 79%, agreed that, quote, Texas public higher education institutions should require a mandatory course on the founding documents and principles of the United States. 79% of Texans want that. And you know this isn't only Texans who want it. There was an Illinois politician who argued that America was losing respect for the Declaration's principles and for the Constitution. He argued that we were in danger of descending into what he called a mobocratic spirit. Well, that politician was Abraham Lincoln. He said that at the age of 29 in his Lyceum address. He had a remedy, and the remedy, to quote from his Lyceum address, is this. He said here, and I quote, he said, the only antidote to democratic degeneration was, quote, to teach reverence for the Constitution in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice, unquote. 160 years later, Ronald Reagan, in his farewell address in 1989, called for the reform of civic education to promote what he called, quote, informed patriotism, unquote. Right? The question that we'll begin here with our panelists is this. Are they right? Should informed patriotism, as Lincoln and Reagan and a number of the founders thought, should that be the primary goal guiding civic education? We'll begin with David Bob. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. Glad to see all of you here, and glad that we can start with such an easy question. This is an important topic, though, and I'm really thrilled that the Texas Public Policy Foundation is addressing it, and it's exciting to see all of those assembled here and the interest that you have. The Bill of Rights Institute, where I work and have been for 6 years, is dedicated to supporting teachers across the country. We work with about a quarter of the nation's teachers have done over the last 20 years of our existence, over 100 programs here in the state of Texas. And I can bring you, despite the parade
Turn
of...
on your mic. Sorry.
I thought it was on.
Yeah, you turned it off. There you go.
Okay.
Okay.
There we are.
Sorry.
Is that better? Yes. Okay, so the basic question is informed patriotism the goal? And I think the good news, despite the huge amount of evidence, some of which Tom cited to kick off our program, is that there is a critical mass of teachers who are every day doing great work and who see informed patriotism as the vital thing that we need. So the short answer to your question, I think, is yes, absolutely. A thoughtful, informed patriotism means that a student has read the Declaration of Independence, read the Constitution, come to know its ideas, and ultimately come to a love and appreciation of those principles, of those ideas. How do you do that? How do you get to that place of knowledge and love? I think the difficult thing is that first step, as so many of those studies have documented, students aren't even getting the basics, right? So that's a problem. They're not, teachers do not have the time. There's a variety of reasons that we could explore about why that's the case. But by the time they're in high school, that's pretty late to start in with a concept like even the separation of powers. You can start at very early grades giving the stories of the American Revolution, of those who have throughout our history fought for freedom. Think of the abolitionists. Think of the suffragettes. Think of those who fought for civil rights, and that the promise of the Declaration might be true and real for all. I think the challenge really is not so much then just the imparting of facts. Because if you ask kids, we've done this a lot at the Bill of Rights Institute, what's your textbook like? The number one word that they come up with is boring. The second word is words, W-O-R-D-Z, right? It just seems like a bunch of facts and dates strung together. And the problem is that those ideological, oftentimes imbalanced, and dreadfully dull textbooks, for which every year in all subject areas, you, the Texas taxpayers, spend about $400 million. Now, if you think of that, how many of you have ever had a textbook that you wanted to get home to, curl up in front of the fireplace, and just dig into, right? They don't really talk about stories. They don't get to the human element. They don't talk about what it really means to own these ideas. So I think what is really such an apt title for this panel, Learning to Live Freely, gives students that introduction, that they can, yes, know those names and dates and be able to gain what we might think of as kind of a historical consciousness, but even more that they can know what the three branches are, but also why do we have three branches? It's a combination, it's a both and. And so before you can get to thoughtful patriotism, there are certain prerequisites that you need, but ultimately what's really missing from the equation is that love and that reverence of which Abraham Lincoln, Alexis DeToqueville, and so many others that have reflected deeply on patriotism have said we need.
Right. Thank you, David.
As an educator, I agree with what he's saying. There's a lot of times our teachers don't have the time to insert some of this stuff, but more importantly, they're told not to because we're worried about our reading and our math scores. And as far as reading and math, reading is involved in every single test that we take. So it is very important, don't get me wrong. But a lot of times the social studies is overlooked. And we do have standards in Texas that aren't being taught in some schools. Some of our schools are doing fabulous jobs. And I've been in some schools that, I might have brought a program to them, or I have a friend in the district and they walk in and they're told, yeah, we don't teach social studies. Or this is the best thing we're gonna have all year, and it's in October. So what happens is that our students need to be exposed to this at an early age. They have to grow and love this. The way we have things set up, we have those standards, and it would be really important. When I was a child, I remember having a social studies class in first grade. We learned a lot of these facts. we don't learn them as in depth as we do in middle school, but we're building that foundation. And our foundation has to be built because we have to build the complexity to it. Our students today, they get to high school and they're getting ready to vote. And they have no idea what they're even voting on. They don't want to watch the television because we're very bipartisan in many cases. So we have to go back and start at the basics. We have to look at our children that are in that kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and introduce them to things, and then continue through their middle school years and build upon it and tell that story. That story is so important. Many of our educators today don't know the story, whether it's the administration or it's your principals. They don't understand you can't just teach a standard when it comes to social studies. You have to teach the story that goes with the standard. So if you actually put a concept such as the Declaration of Independence, and that's part of our Constitution cluster, so to speak. But you have to teach it when it's the road to revolution. You can't just teach it when it's Constitution. You have to make that story for them, and the story builds. And the better that they see the story and they can visualize it, and that's also having, very educated teachers that can transfer the story to them, then they become more interested in it.
Thank you.
As an educator and as a legislator, I am so excited to be on this panel. And I want to thank TPPF for inviting a freshman Democrat to join the panel. One thing I've noticed is that conservative conferences always start on time. Me and my fellow liberals, it's, if 11 o'clock is a suggestion, we may 11:15, 11:30. So I appreciate that, and I'm so excited to be here. Before I was a politician, I was a middle school teacher, and I taught on the west side of San Antonio, a beautiful and historic Mexican-American neighborhood, and one of the poorest zip codes in the entire state of Texas. And my passion for my students and their families is what motivated me to run for office in the first place. And one of the first bills I filed in the legislature was HB 3009, which was a comprehensive civics education bill. And there was bipartisan support for that bill. Representative Ashby, Representative Krause helped me shape that bill and so that it would pass overwhelmingly through the House of Representatives here in Texas. Unfortunately, it died in the Senate because the Texas Senate had a rival civics bill with a better name, by the way. It was Senate Bill 1776. So you can't underestimate the power of a good name for a bill. But the two bills approach civics from very different points of view. Our bill was, one, I completely agree with Dr. Bob about high school is way too late. So our bill was integrating civics education at least once between 4th and 8th grade, and then a second time in high school. Another important difference was that our bill was utilizing project-based learning, and my fellow educator on the panel can attest to the power of project-based learning. There's an old Confucius quote, "Tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, let me do and I understand." So ensuring that our students are authentically and deeply engaging with the content, but then applying it to the world around them. That's how students are going to internalize some of these concepts that we want them to understand. And it will ensure that our students are developing the skills that are necessary to participate both in civic life, but also in the global economy, leadership skills, creativity, critical thinking. This is the type of approach we should take with civics. And so I would adjust President Reagan's quote just slightly. Instead of informed patriotism, I would say critical patriotism. Informed, to me, has a connotation of kind of learning in a passive stance, right? You're receiving information, you are memorizing information, perhaps regurgitating that information on a test, right? But not understanding it deeply, not applying that knowledge to the world around you, and not interrogating some of that knowledge and questioning what you've been told. That's really, those were the traits of our founders from 1776 to 2020. And if that's what we want our students to replicate, we have to give them the skills to critically engage with their own patriotism and with civic life. And so that's where I hope we can head going forward in this discussion about civics.
Excellent. Thank you, Representative Tallarico.
Thank you.
Let me follow up on the great point that Representative Tallarico just made. I mean, the good news is that the concern over restoring sound civic education has gone bipartisan. But of course, being human beings as we are, that's now produced a different debate. And in the civic ed circles, there's a debate over a founding-based documents approach versus what is called action civics or civic engagement. This debate has produced some detractors. A recent article by Robert Pondisio at the Fordham Institute is titled, "Kids as Political Props." And let me just read the first paragraph, and then I'd like our three panelists to comment on it. Pondisio says, "I'm starting to sour on, quote, authentic engagement, unquote, of kids in civic education, a concept that I have long supported and occasionally supervised and even led as a teacher. Preparing young people for active and engaged citizenship is an essential and neglected purpose of public education. How best to cultivate these qualities in school, however, is far from settled in some circles. It can take the form of encouraging children to be directly involved in activism and advocacy, ostensibly student-led, but that, says Pondisio, is, quote, morphing from a valuable instructional strategy into a manipulative and cynical use of children as political props in the service of causes they understand superficially, if at all," unquote. So my question for the panelists is this: what in your minds, obviously there should be civic engagement, right? Now, of course, traditionally that was done, mock elections, a mock constitutional convention, those sorts of things. What should be, what is the ideal relation between what is called action civics or civic engagement? And I don't know, is that also what you mean by project-based? Yeah. Yes, okay. What is the relationship between those and, or what should be the relationship between those and a founding documents-based approach? Michelle, would you like to start?
Well, first off, our students have to know the founding documents. That's just the beginning spot for the whole thing. And you can't do that in kindergarten. You have to spark the interest of what's going on and things that are going on in their lives when they're more in elementary, but you start maybe in 3rd and 4th grade introducing slowly the different documents in a different depth, depending on what it is. So they have to understand what our foundations are. And then from there, you can look at it in many different ways, but the biggest piece is it has to be bipartisan. It has to be something that is good as a citizen. And sometimes in some schools, it's not possible for them to say, let's go out and do this, we're gonna have a sit-in or whatever all is, but there can be scenarios that are proposed. And it takes different organizations to work together. We have law-related education, we have the Bill of Rights Foundation, where we have all different places that can actually help our teachers get these ideas out. Now, sometimes it could be something that they can go out into the community and do, which is fabulous, but they can't always do that. But by using scenarios, it gives them the ideas of things that they could do, and if you give them a possibility of things, several different choices, then they can make some of those decisions, but they're making informed decisions. And that also goes back to, that's that teacher being informed as well as those administrators.
Okay, thank you. Representative Tallarico?
Yeah, I think as an educator, I am never for indoctrination of any type, right? Whether it comes from the left or from the right. What we have to do is give our students the context, the skills, and the knowledge to engage and apply their knowledge in the real world around them. That's what's going to prepare them for life after high school and after post-secondary. And so I worry sometimes that we use the threat of indoctrination, which all of us should be opposed to shut down really rich and fulfilling curriculum that is going to help students really engage authentically with civics education. So I want to draw a line, and then what I want to do is argue that these two approaches are not mutually exclusive, right? Our civics bill that we passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House of Representatives was both project-based and asked students to use what they learn and apply it in their own communities, but also made sure that they were getting a strong foundation in our founding documents, in understanding our founders. That was explicitly written into the bill. So I don't think the action and content are not mutually exclusive. And I think indoctrination should be something that we're all opposed to in every subject, whether it's literature, whether it's science, whether it's social studies. That's not good teaching, and it's not good practice in public education in any subject. But we shouldn't let that fear prohibit us and prevent us from pursuing project-based learning that we know is effective and that we know will adequately prepare our students for the world after high school.
Thank you for that. And before I turn to David, let me just ask a follow-up question. I think you make a very good point here. It doesn't have to be either or. It should be both and it has been. With regard to which of the two is in the driver's seat, are they equal, or is a founding documents-based approach in the driver's seat, or is action civics in the driver's, in your view?
Yeah, so, when I was in the classroom, I wanted my students to use history to inform the future, right? Understanding history and then doing nothing with it is of no use to anyone, because history is alive. History is happening right now, and it will happen tomorrow. And our students, the next generation, will be the ones to shape that. And so I'm always going to be kind of biased toward looking toward the future. I think you need to have a solid and deep understanding of the past in order to shape the future in an effective way for you and your community. But we can't, as discussed earlier, our students can't look at our textbooks and think that it has no relevance to their life or to their life outside of our K through 12 education system.
Okay. Thank you. David?
Action civics, when it strays into activism, is problematic. I think what is essential is that content element, which is so hard to do, be really in the driver's seat, but that doesn't prevent us from having an orientation then that, once having substantiated in the classroom at the local level by teachers, that students are ready to engage and bring those ideas to bear in real-world activity, that can happen. We're nowhere near that happening in so many classrooms across the country. And unfortunately, what we see, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, two of the largest counties in the country, Fairfax County in Virginia, where I reside, and Montgomery County in Maryland, just north of the district, have recently said that their students will get, at the high school level, 3 days of excused absence at which they can attend any protest that they want. Now, you can hear the collective rejoicing that happened among the students, right? Because that's 3 days that they're out of class. But you know what? The problem that I have with that idea is that if you're going to go to something like that and engage and think about sort of what is it to protest, to have a redress of grievances, to speak your mind, there usually was, in that kind of an action, insofar as it involves civil disobedience, some sort of recognition that you were going to have to pay a price for it. By giving students a free pass and telling them, go out and protest and make your voices heard and it doesn't matter what, I think there's a kind of short-circuiting to the process that happens. And I think that holds true whenever we're teaching for a particular ideological agenda, whether it be from the right or from the left. That should not happen in our schools, period. Now, what does that mean? That means that we need teachers who really have a commitment to viewpoint diversity. That means that when you're tackling these hard subjects, that you're really going into the amount of depth that you need and starting early, as you said, Michelle, so that you're conditioning not only that preparation, and because this is an exercise, after all, of the head and the heart, right? Patriotism is ultimately about love. It's also learning to recognize that it's not my country, right or wrong, but it's an adherence to the principles, to the ideas. Let me give you a quick example of how I think this can happen, because I do support the idea that teachers need a broad range of tools in their toolkit. Sure. That includes very serious encounters with primary source documents. That's really at the heart of what we do at the Bill of Rights Institute. It also includes then the ability to be a good storyteller or to rely on those who are. It includes project-based learning, PBL for short. It's been a great and useful trend in the United States that we've seen more teachers relying on that. But there's good PBL and there's bad PBL, right? And the challenge is to ensure that there's the kind of training, the teaching of the educators, which isn't so much experts coming in and telling them this is the line that you need to toe, but it's really a kind of conversation that happens. We engage in those rich, deep conversations with teachers, and we find that the lion's share of them want to talk about these hard issues, but you know what stops them often? It's the administrators. It's the building principal who says, I don't want any fights on my hand. I don't want you to talk about issue X, say immigration. It's the superintendent. It's the legal counsel that sends out the note at the beginning of the school year. That has a chilling effect on the ability for these critical conversations to happen. So what we do at the Bill of Rights Institute is give teachers a vehicle by which they can learn the means for effectively doing this, for not having action civics stray into activist civics. So take, for example, women's suffrage. We're marking 100 years this year that women have had the right to vote. We drew up a curriculum at the Bill of Rights Institute chronicling that long, hard struggle for the adoption of the 19th Amendment. That's a great story, right? That's the history that's so important to know. The future-oriented part of that is thinking, how do you do social change within a constitutional context? And there's a roadmap that can be learned from those women and men who fought for the right for women to vote. That can be a blueprint, in fact, and what we bring out in the second part of that curriculum is asking the students, reflect deeply on what it means to think constitutionally, and then think about the changes that you see that are necessary and blend the two. Too often things are happening in this country where the two are put in opposition. The 1619 Project I would name as one that has set up a framework in which students, unfortunately, who right now may feel most alienated from our country's founding and from those principles, that alienation is stoked rather than ameliorated. And I think our challenge today in districts like the one in which you taught, Representative Tallarico, and in the one, Michelle, you're working in, is to bring those principles alive to students so that they can embrace them in their own lives and they can see that the American dream, no matter what they're growing up with, what circumstances they're in, is for them.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to continue, do another round on this question that we're talking about. We, all four of us agree that indoctrination is anathema to genuine civic education for a self-governing people. Having asked that, let me tell you just a brief story of what happened to me. In June, we launched the first class, the Texas Public Policy Foundation Summer Institute for Civics Teachers. We brought in teachers from across the state. We went through 30 hours of professional development consisting of the Declaration, the Constitution, selected Federalist essays, selections from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and the first Lincoln-Douglas debate. Okay? In that class, one of the teachers, and Michelle knows this well, she was there, told the rest of us, she said, by the time students today reach middle school age, they come to class already cynical about the American regime. Now, when she said that, all of the other teachers said, that's right, and one of them added, and it gets worse every year. Okay, all right. That's a problem, yes. In light of that, return to where we all agree we want to avoid indoctrination. Is a civic education whose fundamental purpose is guided by Lincoln's directive to teach, not just to teach the Constitution, but to teach reverence for the Constitution, which Reagan then turned into informed patriotism? Is that indoctrination? Start with you, David. Oh, I'm sorry. No, Representative Tallarico, it was your turn in the queue.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
When I think of one of my heroes, Benjamin Franklin, maybe the most prominent free thinker in the history of our country, what he would say about students being cynical in middle school, I'm sure he would celebrate that we have students who are already at middle school questioning assumptions that they've been given by previous generations and engaging with them critically. I'm sure his worst nightmare would be passive students who accept what they're told and never ask any questions. I want to differentiate, when we talk about indoctrination, every teacher, every educator, including the two up here, have biases, right? We all have biases, our own prejudices, our own worldviews, and it's almost impossible to prevent that from seeping into your teaching. What we need to train educators, to Dr. Bob's point, is how to recognize that bias, how to label it, and let students know when it's happening, right? Whenever I, in the classroom, would bring up a personal view of mine, I always do my best to make sure I had a disclaimer. And I told students, this is my personal view, and there are people who disagree with me. Let me expose you to people who disagree with Mr. Tallarico's personal view. It's impossible to tell teachers never to have their bias enter in. What we need to do is be cognizant of it, recognize it, and then control it in a classroom setting that it's a way that's healthy for students and for educators. So that's one. Two, what I worry about in the civics discussion, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day on Monday. In his letter in a Birmingham jail, which I think should be considered along with our founding documents, I'm sure Dr. Bob would agree, in that letter he talks about the difference between negative peace and positive peace. And negative peace is the absence of tension. Positive peace is the presence of justice. Because we don't talk about our disagreements doesn't mean that's real peace, right? Real peace is engaging with those disagreements, leaning into those tensions, and recognizing that cynicism, and then coming at it with a deep love for one another and a deep love of our country. I think of the James Baldwin quote, which I'm paraphrasing, that he has such a deep love for America that he reserves the right to criticize her endlessly, right? That's what real deep love looks like. Superficial love is what I used to have when I was younger. I was a huge nerd when I was a little kid. When I was in elementary school, I was obsessed with the founding fathers. Read every book there was. I had John Thumble's painting in my room, so you can tell I didn't have a lot of friends. But that love when I was little was a superficial love. I loved Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson the way I loved Superman and Batman, right? There were no flaws. There was no shades of gray. There was no complexity. As I grew older, that love turned into a real love where I saw the problems with our founders, the flaws of our founders, the flaws in our founding documents, but appreciated the direction that they were trying to head in and the framework they set up to resolve our differences critically and thoughtfully. That's what I want our students to lean into. I don't want to paper over disagreements. I don't want to push aside cynicism. I don't want to punish tension. I want to celebrate those things and try to, as an educator, channel it into something productive, right? Something that will make our community better. And Dr. Bob, I would love to, the question I have is, what is the difference between action and activism, right? And you've thought about this much more than I have, but activism to me is not a dirty word. I think of our founding fathers as the ultimate activists, right? If activism is pushing for social and community change, I don't see anything wrong with that as long as our educators are not letting their bias push students in one direction. I would love an education system where our students are so passionate about being activists that they create, a little college Republicans and a college Democrats, or sorry, I guess high school, but would it be high school Democrats, high school Republicans, high school Libertarians, and they have these great debates among each other, and they're passionate in their viewpoint. That's what I want. I think the worst case is a sea of apathetic students who are told to obey the rules, color within the lines, and never ask questions. I can't think of a worse situation for our country, and I can't think of a situation where our founding fathers would approve of that kind of behavior from our young people.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Tallarico. David?
I think if we go back to Ben Franklin for a second, there's a difference between cynicism and question asking, right? And when you have a middle schooler or you have a young person coming in who is already cynical, that implies a kind of antipathy. And I think the job of civics is to really build up the means by which students can come to love what is beautiful about those founding principles. Yes, there's people involved, right? Wherever there is people, there are flaws. George Washington was not perfect. Ben Franklin was not perfect. But what I think is interesting to think about in the educational endeavor is at what point is it appropriate to talk about each of those things, right? So the Parson Weems version of George Washington, right, gives that picture of a sort of pre-perfect or sort of perfect from the get-go, I cannot tell a lie, and all of that sort of thing. But, I have kids right now of my own who are 8 and 10. And we've talked about the institution of slavery and the American founding. You can do it with really young kids. You can do it in such a way that they understand the challenges, the problems, the bad decisions, the good decisions. And I think what you do, I think the man for our hour really today is Frederick Douglass. Because what he says is to those young people that are feeling very dispossessed from the American founding, perhaps because of that very institution of slavery. You know what? I was there. I was a slave, and I came away feeling very alienated from those very founders. But you know what he did? He read. And he opened his mind and his heart, and what he realized is that they had created an edifice that he looked at not so much as a monument to this institution of evil, but as a scaffolding built on a building that was sound and that had solid foundations. A scaffolding that by later generations could be removed. And in fact, he said, I want to be one of those agents of change to remove that forever. I think that's the message and the way to beat back some of that cynicism. And here's the problem, and I think this may go towards that question of what's the distinction between action civics or action and activism. Mm-hmm. If you look at the 1619 Project, for example, it short-circuits the good pedagogical approach that is necessary for kids to learn these ideas. For example, one of the lesson plans for this thing, so the New York Times has published this thing called the 1619 Project, which really says that the founding of this country was marked by the first transatlantic slaves arriving in the colonies in the year 1619, rather than 1776. And that from the get-go, this country, even before it was founded with the Declaration, was devoted mainly to a kind of slaveocracy and a slavocratic mentality. So, for example, one of the lesson plans is to say, take the Declaration of Independence, create an erasure poem. This means that you blot out the text that you don't want, revealing the words that you would and the kind of feelings that you have reading that document. To me, that is precisely the kind of lesson plan that spurs more of that cynicism than the idea of let's read the document to really understand it. Let's deeply inhabit what those words meant. What did it mean for slaveholders to say that slavery was wrong? Because that's what that document did. It said that all human beings are equal. Now, did they get to the immediate realization of that? No, they did not. Many of them lamented that they did not get there. But I think if you have a social justice agenda, you have an environmental justice agenda, or you have a classical liberal agenda, and you're the teacher and you're preaching that, it's not good. When I taught at the college level for 15 years, I did not reveal my own opinions about controversial matters. Because once you do as a teacher, the kids know that they're going to toe that line, right? Because you have the power of their grade. So I agree with you about the bias and the revelation of that. That can be an important learning process, especially for high school and some middle school students. But ultimately, I think what we want is not to lead the kids out into protests, but to give them the tools by which they can enter into those things on their own time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Michelle, would you like to add?
I agree with Dr. Bob here. My students never knew, was I a Republican or a Democrat? Because in my eyes, it was so important for them to be an informed voter. You know, and how are you going to live your life as, you know, what you see as right and wrong? We have many people out there who do show their bias, and it's nothing wrong if you show your bias and then you show the other side. If you're not showing both sides, then you're just pushing your agenda out there. And we do have teachers out there that do that, and sometimes they don't know the difference because they've done it for so long. But it's basically creating that capacity within the teachers to make sure that they know what all of the background knowledge is, those founding documents, why we have them, how our forefathers actually struggled trying to create the Declaration of Independence and so forth. Looking at things from the archives saying, okay, we have the Declaration of Independence, but let's look at the original version. They had plans to take certain things. I mean, our Constitution does not have the word slave written in it at all because they didn't like that. They didn't want our country to see that. And so therefore what they're doing is that they had ways that they wanted to make sure that in the future, we would be resolving some of these problems. Many of our documents, they're all compromises. We put Band-Aids on things for the longest time till we got to that Civil War. And so it's showing the students that we had different sides. And you can be on one side or you can be on the other, no matter, you know, what political party you are, but it's making sure that you are informed about what's going on and you make good choices from the knowledge that you've gained.
Thank you. Michelle referenced the first draft of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. The final charge in it, and the most powerful charge, because it's arranged from less to more, right? When you're prosecuting a case, you don't say, he killed somebody, he kidnapped somebody, and he jaywalked, right? You start the other way, right? So he starts, you know, the Declaration starts with, he's refused to sign good laws. Well, legislatures say that about executives all the time. The final one in the original draft says that the King of Great Britain has committed cruel war against human nature itself, enslaving men, and he puts men in capitals, right? Now, for reasons I probably don't have to tell you, that's not how the Declaration ended up, because you wouldn't have had the South join, and without the South, you couldn't have won the Revolutionary War, and not a single slave would have been freed, right? Something, unfortunately, we don't teach today. Instead, we teach that the presence of slavery shows they were all just a bunch of hypocrites and didn't care. Now, that's not just, I would say that's probably taught least in the K-12 schools. I think the reason kids come to school cynical by a young age is because of the culture, because of Hollywood, because of the media, which all teaches that, right? It all teaches that. And as far as the New York Times project, the reason they call it 1619 is because their fundamental premise is that America's fundamental identity is grounded on the institution of slavery. I didn't hear that from any of you three, correct? None of you think that, yes.
I want to hit a few points, and I want to start with a story of a student that I had my first year of teaching named Michael, African-American student, 6th grade. We discussed founding documents in our class. It was a language arts class, but I was a social studies buff, so I integrated as much as I could. And Michael raised his hand and asked such a good question that some of us may fear as cynical, or you're being too negative, Michael. Don't be a party pooper to the party of America, right? He asked, how can these documents say that I am 3/5 of a person?
No.
How can I trust these documents? What a great question. Does that question make me uncomfortable? Yes. Should that question make all of us uncomfortable? Yes. Does it unsettle me? Yes. Was it hard to try to figure out how I was going to answer it? Yes. But instead of shutting down the conversation or criticizing his cynicism as a 11-year-old boy, I tried to use that to open up a conversation and use it as a teachable moment and talk about how our founding fathers are not heroes. They're also not villains. They were human beings, complex, brilliant, flawed, right? And that's okay. Coming to grips with that truth leads to a much deeper love of America that is a real love, not a superficial love of a fairy tale, right? And so I agree with Dr. Bob that cynicism as educators and as Americans, we should try to channel that into something ultimately productive. But that cynicism is a starting point, and we need to meet students where they're at, acknowledge their lived experiences, their fears, their questions, and use that as a starting point for a conversation and for real teaching and real learning. So I don't fear tension in the classroom. I don't fear questions in the classroom. I don't fear cynics in the classroom. In fact, if I had my preference, I would like to I'd prefer to take a cynic, starting as a cynic, rather than starting as an eternal optimist. The cynic I can work with to unpack those questions and ultimately give us answers, right? The person who doesn't ask any questions has no curiosity, and that's not what America is all about. America is about questioning our current reality and then building the power to change it. Can you imagine if our founders had been taught not to be cynics when they were in school, if their questions had been shut down, if they were told, try as best you can to always respect the king, right? Never question the king or the monarchy. That's the British dream, right? We want our young people, just like our founders, to look at the world around them and then dream of a way that the world could be different for themselves and for the next generation.
Thank you. I've just got a sign here that it's time to turn this over for your questions from the audience. And before we do, I just want to make one point. Like you, Representative Tallarico, I too have had students who have come and said, this document says that these people are only 3/5 of a human being. It's a wonderful opportunity, you're right. And what I show them is that the good news is it's not true. Instead, if the 3/5 compromise was meant to say that the slaves were only equal to 3/5 of a human being, which side do you think would have been pushing it? The North or the South? In fact, the South wanted all their slaves to count for full persons. It was the North that said no. Why? Because the North said they're not citizens. How can you represent, right? But a trade was made. Why? Because by agreeing to 3/5, which said nothing about the humanity of the slaves, the North would get some much needed taxes because the population of the South would go up because of the 3/5, and the South would get additional representation, which it wanted to keep the sectional balance, right? So you're right, it's a wonderful opportunity to invite students, but
And
I know we're doing,
Can I just make a point just about Michael? I would never, when Michael brought that question, tell me that it was not true. Because although your historical and political analysis may be correct, his question was, why were white folks in 1776 debating about my humanity? That's the depth of his question, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Yeah, they weren't, that's the point.
You what?
They weren't debating their humanity.
They weren't debating the humanity.
They were not debating the humanity of the slave. But hey, folks, we have questions.
This is a great example of why I think civics education is helpful.
Here you go. Oh, what was that? I'm sorry, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Here?
There's a microphone there for you. All right, and then Jackie will be next.
Okay. Just a couple things. I think, Michelle, you mentioned that math and reading might be crowding out civics, and I just wanted to make the point that in my school, we read about Nathan Hale, we read about Paul Revere, we read about a lot of our founders. So the two are not mutually exclusive. I also took a note on my concern about black kids in particular. I mean, the black culture in our country is stalled on the far left, as we all know, to the tune of 95% of our precious political capital. And I think that our black kids are being overdosed by the liberals tearing down historical icons and just a very negative kind of a take on history, the history of our country. It really concerns me because that was not the case in my generation. It wasn't a black, white, Chinese, whatever issue. It was American history that I was taught 20 miles west of Philadelphia. So those two things are really bothersome. And and then we're over-focused on the flaws of our founding fathers, but the same is not true with reference to the flaws in President Obama, the flaws in Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X. All of those leaders had flaws. Why are we so over-focused on the flaws of our founding fathers?
Who would like to respond?
I'll just make a quick comment. I absolutely agree that every leader throughout history from 1619 to 2020 should be critically examined for shortcomings and flaws, right? Every human being who has been a leader in our country, from President Obama, Frederick Douglass to Thomas Jefferson, has been a complex figure. And my point is that complexity is more engaging for students because it's honest, right? And that's the type of honesty that we should strive for in our civics education, because I believe, as Dr. Bob mentioned, that that's how we get to that authentic love. Because authentic love includes accountability, right? That's the kind of love we have for our family members. We don't excuse mistakes in our families. We don't excuse and erase flaws. We confront those, hold them accountable, and yet still love the members of our family, and that's the kind of love we should have for our country. So thank you for your comments.
And I'll respond if I might as well. I think that the challenge is, I mean, if you think about Martin Luther King, for example, would you hesitate, Representative Tallarico, to say of him that he's a hero?
No, I would not want to call any historical figure a villain or a hero.
Well, I think that, I mean, part of the informed patriotism and the idea of civics, I think, is not to erect a pantheon, right, of godlike figures, because after all of these men and women within history, whether American or beyond, are human beings. But when MLK had a chance to meet Mahatma Gandhi, he said it's kind of like meeting Washington, Madison, and Jefferson all at once, right? All of them were heroic to him. And what we've done, I agree with your question and the premise there. I think we have tilted way too far in the direction of if it had been the case in the past that there were men and women on pedestals, we've knocked them off and said we're going to continue to knock them off, and that's what we're doing. Because I think there's a way as a teacher to, without forcing a kind of civil religion here and proselytizing on behalf of that, to say that there are remarkable, heroic things that were accomplished at the time of the American founding. And let's look at what those things are. Let's also critically engage and understand that there were problems and that there were things that were failings. Because you know what? The men who were at the Constitutional Convention said that of themselves. Yeah. But they also reflected to themselves that there's something, this was the term that Madison used, even miraculous, that's even happening, right? And so there's a way, I think, to do that at a grade level appropriateness. And the zeitgeist, I can tell you right now, in our schools too often, not from a lot of teachers, but from some of those other cultural forces that you pointed to, is more on that knock them down to size, so that they've shrunk so much to the point that by the time that a kid would come into the 6th grade, they're already a hard-bitten cynic. Not like a Franklin, kind of skeptic who's a clear and critical thinker, but it's a rescue project then to bring them around and say that America is worth fighting for.
Jack, you had, yes.
I guess, incidentally, I'm really impressed with what you guys are talking about and the willingness to do exactly what you teach, which is to have healthy dialogue. Very cool. However, I got to make the obvious statement that is, you in the teaching world work for me. I'm a parent of 7 children, and good parenting is an art form, which we learn on the fly, right? As an understatement. But parenting is a hold and release art form, okay? We don't release them to thinking whatever you feel is the right thing when they're of middle school age, okay? Or hopefully by college. My goodness, the investment that I've made emotionally and everything else is well thought. So you guys having worked for me, you talk about critical patriotism or critical stuff, but where's the critical thinking? That's my question is, are you guys teaching critical thinking? Because if questionable assumptions not recognized lead to questionable results. So please, are you teaching critical thinking or whatever the phrase is that needs to be taught and taught in a hard way?
So in most classrooms it is taught, and it's taught in a gradated version depending on what grade they are in. So you're going to have some hardcore questions and critical thinking going along with those questions in high school that you wouldn't debate in elementary school. So it is going on in the classrooms, and your teachers do have part of that as part of their standards, and they are supposed to be doing that because we want our children to be informed, and then ultimately they can make those good choices and make those decisions.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that's what we're talking about up here is critical thinking. We're applying it to civics and social studies because that's the panel. But I think we would expand this to language arts and science. I think we would absolutely advocate for critical thinking being integrated into all of those content areas. And I will disagree. As a teacher, I don't believe I work for you. I think I work for democracy, and I work for the American experiment, and I work for this republic. If we see education as kind of a fee for service between our taxpayers and our public schools, that can lead us down a dangerous path. I think if we are teaching in service to democracy, which I think public education is the bedrock of a strong democracy, a strong republic, then that changes your frame for how you approach students in the classroom. And that's the obligation I felt as a teacher, that I was helping to preserve this experiment of America and ensure that it was protected for years to come by the next generation. And so when you have that kind of sense of responsibility, then I think you engage in a much deeper way with some of these topics. And you want to make sure your students are healthy skeptics and healthy cynics, and that they're asking the kind of questions that need to be asked, and then channeling that into something that is beautiful and productive for the future of our country.
I'd like to address the critical thinking component very briefly. The Bill of Rights Institute will launch in April a comprehensive 500-year history of the United States of America. To do so and align it to the advanced placement standards that the College Board has put out, we hired 100 historians. They span every subfield of history and a wide array of viewpoints. You know how in a textbook you never know quite who's writing what? It's written by a committee. Right. There's a lot of things that are problematic about textbooks. We gave each of those historians a byline. That way the kids can figure out what is it that they stand for, what are they expert in, where are they coming from? And there's a lot of questions that are built into this bank of 2,500 questions there that help them with that critical thinking. Our partner in this endeavor is OpenStax out of Rice University. This ties into your taxpayer question. $400 million paid in textbooks, many of them clunky 10-pounders. I would suggest to you, I'm not a Texas taxpayer, but I would be really mad if that's where my money was going. I think you should look hard at this group, OpenStax, and others in the open education resource arena, because what they are doing with charitable dollars is publishing high-quality materials written by people who are expert in their fields and bringing them to bear in a way that is engaging. What this does is open access, because if you're a student in San Antonio where you taught, I bet it's pretty hard if you're an 11th grader for that district to afford $100 per book per pupil for advanced placement U.S. history. But there's no fewer number of those kids that ought to be in APUSH, AP U.S. history, than in a wealthy suburb of Houston or a wealthy suburb of Dallas. And what has happened is the textbook cartel, and it's a cartel, they get together with the cronies that figure out who's going to decide which textbooks we're going to adopt, and they buy those things. Teachers aren't part of that calculus. They aren't at the table making that decision. It's Pearson, Cengage, Houghton Mifflin, and the rest of them that gets a contract, and $400 million of your money goes out every year, and I think we can do better than that.
All right. Thank you. Go ahead, Miss.
So I hear several statements that you talk about PBL, project-based learning, and there's so many opinions about project-based learning. There is good and bad. I've actually been to numerous things where even the children were saying how there's bullying in the classroom with project-based learning, and we see bullying by teachers as well. So the caveat that I hear is that if you could, in a lot of what you're saying could be prefaced by saying, in a perfect world. We're not in a perfect world. We don't have, the majority of our teachers are pushing an agenda. I went to the legislature, and I saw hundreds of kids there with talking points that were obviously biased talking points, hundreds. And they say they go to the legislature in sixth grade every year. That's part of their field trips. And so my question is, how do you see us taking this off of this rail that is obviously headed for destruction for our constitutional republic?
Question.
I assume that was directed toward me, but So, yes, I agree that everything that I've said, I think everything we've discussed, assumes good teaching and good learning in classrooms. There is bullying in all types of instructional environments, and there has been bullying in classrooms that use project-based learning, that use direct instruction. I'm sure the worst teachers we have that turn on a video, there's still bullying going on in the classroom, and that's an issue I care deeply about. My team and I at the Capitol have crafted a lot of legislation to try to make sure that we are doing everything we can to combat bullying and everything we can to do to make sure that we are developing our teachers to be excellent instructors and excellent facilitators in the classroom. So what I want to avoid is using problems currently in our educational system to prohibit us from using certain proven techniques in the classroom, if that makes sense. We've seen the evidence for project-based learning. Educators from a wide variety of viewpoints, a wide variety of content areas agree that it is an excellent instructional method if it's executed correctly. And that caveat, being executed correctly, is true of every instructional method, right? Using a PowerPoint and using direct instruction to students, that can be done well or it can be done horribly. So if your question is how do we make sure that all of our educators in every classroom across Texas, no matter their zip code, are excellent educators, that's a discussion that I engage with all the time, and I would love to engage in more. But I think it's a little different from talking about specific instructional methods. But thank you for your question.
Yes.
First of all, thank you to all of you for being here. Michelle, I wanted to just mention something that you mentioned earlier, and you talked about the importance of storytelling. And so my family and I came from the Soviet Union, and I can tell you that that story, the reason we're here in this country is because of freedom. That's number one. So how are we supposed to educate educators and students if they don't care? They don't care about the documents. They don't see how it's relevant. So if we can tell the story so it's relevant, so they understand the importance of, number one, freedom, and then number two, economic opportunity, and number three, the things that we teach. And my question actually is about indoctrination. We teach about Adam Smith, maybe sometimes, some teachers, maybe some don't know about Adam Smith, but they think he wrote the Wealth of Nations. Well, he didn't. He wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What made Western civilization so incredible? Why does everybody in the world want to come to the United States? So I think going back even further, before the Founding Fathers, why are we here in the first place? What makes this country amazing? Why should our students care? We need to bring it back a little more. So that's my question. Is that indoctrination, teaching Adam Smith, teaching Frederick Bastiat, who wrote the law?
I think when you're looking at our apathetic students, because we have a handful of them no matter what classroom you're looking in, you have to build relevance, and that's the one word that you used. They have to understand why it's important to them, which is those teachers that have been trained well, have gone to school and understand the content. And then they have to be that enthusiastic person that, invigorates those kids and makes them want to learn. You have to be able to tell the story. When I was in a classroom, I did something as simple as making them all stand up. And we talked about rivets on their jeans, okay? Because we had Levi's, and that was part of the gold rush. And it's something that they didn't even think about. But it made them go, oh, wait a minute. Well, the jeans that they made then is something that is affecting me now in some way. Okay, and that's just one little example. But you have to make it so that they understand how important it is, that they know what's going on. They understand what's going on in current events, especially when you're getting to high school and you're getting to the age where you have to vote, where you have to become an informed person. Otherwise, other people will make those decisions for you.
I'm afraid we're out of time. But we're happy to continue the discussion up here afterwards. But we've got other people that will be coming in. I think this is a great sign, though. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.